The Amazon is famous for being the largest rainforest on the planet, but that reputation might actually be missing the point entirely. Because if you don't understand what truly drives this place, the most breathtaking locations scattered across the basin become little more than pretty scenery. They lose the deeper meaning that makes them genuinely unforgettable. The size is impressive, certainly, but size alone has never explained why a place matters. And the Amazon matters in ways that go far beyond what any number can capture. So before we set out toward the most extraordinary corners of the Amazon, we're going to start somewhere unexpected, with a handful of remarkable facts, details that explain how this ecosystem actually operates, why it looks the way it does, and what separates it from every other landscape on Earth. And think of these not as background information, but as lenses, because without them, you're only seeing the surface. And once those facts are in place, the destinations we reach later, particularly the last three, will reveal themselves in an entirely new light. The Amazon covers a territory so immense that no map really does it justice. We're talking about roughly 2.1 million square miles, an area that comes close to matching the entire eastern half of the United States. Lay it over a map of Europe, and it swallows the continent. But the scale alone isn't the story. What truly sets this region apart isn't its size. It's what happens inside it. And the further you look beneath the surface, the more the Amazon stops resembling a forest and starts behaving like something alara, a single, breathing, a self-regulating system that has been quietly perfecting itself for tens of millions of years. One of the strangest forces behind that system originates not in South America at all, but thousands of miles away, across an entire ocean. Every year, around 180 million tons of dust lift off the surface of the Sahara Desert and drift westward on Atlantic winds, traveling close to 4,300 miles before descending over the Amazon basin. Packed inside that dust is phosphorus, a nutrient the forest cannot produce on its own, but cannot survive without. The soils beneath the Amazon are, in many areas, surprisingly poor, stripped of minerals by millions of years of heavy rainfall. What replenishes them, in part, is this invisible annual shipment from the driest place on Earth. Remove that delivery from Africa, and large portions of the Amazon would begin to deteriorate. It's one of the most counterintuitive relationships in all of nature, a desert quietly sustaining a rainforest. And most people go their entire lives without ever hearing about it. The Sahara and the Amazon are separated by an ocean, and yet they are bound together in a cycle that neither could easily survive without. The Amazon's relationship with water is equally surprising and equally misunderstood. Most people assume a rainforest simply receives rainfall, that it is, in essence, a passive recipient of weather. But the Amazon doesn't just absorb rain, it produces it. Every tree in the forest releases water vapor through a process called transpiration. Scale that process across hundreds of billions of trees, and the volume of moisture being pushed into the atmosphere becomes staggering, enough to generate entire weather systems from scratch. A single large tree can release more than 260 gallons of water into the air each day from one tree in 24 hours. Now multiply that across billions of trees spread over 2 million square miles, and the numbers become almost impossible to hold in your head. What results from all of that combined release is what scientists have named flying rivers. Massive, invisible corridors of atmospheric moisture that flow through the sky above the forest, following routes shaped by topography, temperature, and wind. Some of these airborne rivers carry more water than the Amazon River itself. The regions they eventually reach, sometimes thousands of miles away, depend entirely on that moisture to sustain their own rainfall patterns. Cities and farmlands far from the Amazon are, in a very real sense, fed by a forest they may never see. Cut enough of that forest down, and the flying rivers weaken, and the consequences ripple outward far beyond the basin's borders. But here's where things get even stranger. The Amazon's atmosphere and its waterways share an almost eerie symmetry. On the ground, rivers branch and spread like veins across nearly 4,000 miles of terrain, stretching from the Andes all the way to the Atlantic. High above them, invisible streams of air trace surprisingly similar routes through the sky. It's as though the forest maintains two separate circulatory systems, one flowing beneath your feet, one flowing far overhead. And together, they help explain how the Amazon manages to sustain itself even through extended dry periods, continuously moving water from one part of the basin to another, feeding itself when the rains temporarily disappear. The forest, in other words, is not at the mercy of the weather. To a remarkable degree, it makes the weather. The physical structure of the forest adds yet another layer of complexity. The Amazon is not one uniform jungle. It's a patchwork of entirely distinct ecosystems that can shift dramatically within the space of just a couple of miles. Some zones flood for months at a stretch, with water levels climbing more than 33 feet above their dry season lows, enough to submerge the lower floors of a 3-story building. Others never flood at all, as certain areas grow on nutrient-stripped white sand soils that produce landscapes closer to open savanna than dense jungle, dotted with stunted trees and sparse undergrowth that looks nothing like the popular image of the Amazon. Others sit on ancient, mineral-rich ground capable of supporting some of the tallest trees on the continent, their canopies forming an unbroken ceiling nearly 200 feet overhead. These contrasts explain why two patches of forest separated by barely 2 miles can host completely different collections of species, as if they belong to different worlds entirely. And in many ecological senses, they do. And speaking of species, the biodiversity packed into this basin is almost beyond comprehension. Within a single area the size of a soccer field, you might encounter more than 300 distinct tree species. That's greater tree diversity in one small patch than exists across many entire countries in the temperate world. And it doesn't stop at trees. Some research suggests that just 4 square miles of Amazon forest can contain more species of ants than the entire British Isles. That kind of density forces scientists to rethink how they study this place. Sampling one location tells you almost nothing about the next. Every ridge, every riverbank, every isolated grove can open onto an entirely new chapter of life. New plants, new insects, new relationships between organisms that have been evolving together for millions of years. The Amazon doesn't repeat itself. Every corner is its own experiment. But biodiversity here isn't only biological, it's human. The Amazon basin is home to more than 300 distinct indigenous groups, speaking languages from dozens of separate families, a linguistic diversity that rivals the biological variety of the forest itself. Some communities have developed knowledge systems of extraordinary precision, capable of identifying hundreds of plant species on site and describing their medicinal, nutritional, and practical uses without hesitation. Others carry oral histories stretching back centuries, encoding detailed records of river behavior, seasonal flood patterns, and shifting winds with an accuracy that modern researchers have repeatedly confirmed. And in the most remote corners of the basin, there are still groups who have chosen to have no contact with the outside world whatsoever. People who have actively rejected engagement and whose territories are legally protected as a result. But their continued existence is a reminder that the Amazon is not simply a natural space. It is a cultural landscape, shaped and tended by human hands across thousands of years, and still inhabited by people whose relationship with it runs deeper than most of us can imagine. Beneath all of that, another layer of human history waits underground. Hidden below the forest floor lies a network of unusually dark, fertile soils, unlike anything that forms naturally in this environment. These soils, known as Terra preta, literally dark earth, were deliberately engineered by pre-Columbian civilizations more than 2,000 years ago. Communities mixed charcoal, ash, food scraps, and organic material to create ground capable of supporting dense agriculture in a region where natural soils are notoriously thin and poor, and that enriched soil is still extraordinarily productive today. Crops grown on Terra preta outperform those grown on surrounding soils by significant margins, and agricultural researchers have spent decades trying to understand and replicate the process. What makes it even more remarkable is that Terra preta appears to regenerate itself over time, continuing to rebuild its own fertility long after the people who created it are gone. It is a gift left by vanished civilizations still working after 2 millennia. Even the sound of the Amazon holds surprises. In some stretches of the forest, the noise is overwhelming. Insects, birds, frogs, and monkeys layering sound upon sound in every direction, building a wall of biological noise so dense it can feel almost physical. But in other areas, particularly in the dense understory during certain hours of the day, Manaus is one of the strangest cities on Earth, a fully modern urban center sitting in the absolute middle of a rainforest that extends for hundreds of miles in every direction. What makes it so difficult to rationalize isn't just the location. It's the fact that it exists at all, that someone looked at this spot deep in the Amazon and decided to build not just a settlement, but a city of genuine ambition and scale. Its origins trace back to the rubber boom of the late 1800s, when the Amazon briefly became the world's only reliable source of natural rubber. And the wealth that poured into Manaus was almost obscene in its speed and volume. Within the space of a few decades, a remote trading outpost became one of the richest cities in South America. The city's elite, determined to signal their status on a global stage, began importing everything they could conceive of: European architects, Italian marble, wrought ironwork shipped from France, hardwood flooring from the forests of Portugal. And these materials traveled nearly 4,350 miles through dense jungle and along winding river systems before arriving at a construction site deep in the Amazon. The result was the Teatro Amazonas, an opera house of such elaborate ambition, with its dome covered in thousands of ceramic tiles in the colors of the Brazilian flag, that it still feels completely surreal standing inside it, with rainforest pressing against the city in every direction outside. But Manaus wasn't shaped by wealth alone. Its geography carries its own drama. The city sits precisely where two rivers with completely different characters converge. Dark, acidic water flowing in from the north, and a sediment-heavy current sweeping in from the west. That collision has shaped local ecology, transportation patterns, and daily life in ways that are still playing out today. And just beyond the city's edge, where the river begins to widen, something happens that early explorers found genuinely difficult to explain. Just a short distance from Manaus, two of the continent's largest rivers flow side by side for nearly 4 miles without mixing. On one side, the Rio Negro moves slowly with dark, tea-colored water, stained by tannins released from decaying organic material upstream. On the other, the Solimões pushes forward, carrying a pale, sediment-laden current that has traveled thousands of miles from the slopes of the Andes, picking up minerals and particles along the way. And between them runs a boundary so sharp and clean, it looks as though someone cut a line directly through the water with a ruler. Stand at the edge of a boat passing over that line, and you can reach down and touch two completely different rivers at the same time. The physics behind it are straightforward once you understand them. The Rio Negro is warm, slow, and highly acidic. The Solimões is cooler, faster, and dense with suspended particles. Their differences in temperature, speed, and density prevent them from blending immediately, so they travel together in parallel, separated by a visible seam, until their properties gradually equalize and the currents finally merge into a single, unified river. At that point, the Amazon River, as most of the world knows it, officially begins. Explorers puzzled over this boundary for generations, offering explanations ranging from the reasonable to the fantastical. Anavilhanas Archipelago is a freshwater maze with no real equivalent anywhere else in the Amazon. Stretching for roughly 235 miles along the Rio Negro, it holds thousands of islands, narrow channels, and hidden waterways that continuously change shape as the river rises and falls throughout the year. From above, during the dry season, it looks like a giant river has been threaded through a scattered collection of green islands, elongated, forested, separated by clear channels of dark water. From the water, it feels like a labyrinth with no fixed walls, because the walls themselves move with the seasons. During the dry season, exposed sandbars and long, low islands define the landscape. Then the river climbs, water pours into the surrounding forest, and the entire system reconfigures itself. Channels appear beneath tree canopies. Islands shrink or vanish. Areas that were dry land become open water navigable by boat. This ongoing transformation is not just visually dramatic, it's ecologically essential. Sediment redistributes year after year, building new islands in one place while dissolving others elsewhere, slowly rewriting the geography of the archipelago over decades. Pink river dolphins follow the flooded corridors into feeding grounds that don't exist in the dry season. Fish move into submerged forest to spawn among branches, laying eggs in locations that will be dry land again before those eggs hatch. Birds nest in zones that were completely underwater just months before. Researchers describe Anavilhanas as a living laboratory, a place where the relationship between water, land, and life is never settled, never fixed, always negotiating with itself. The Amazon River itself operates at a scale that strains comparison. At peak flow, it pushes more than 70,000 cubic feet of water per second into the Atlantic, enough to fill over 80,000 Olympic swimming pools every single minute. And it discharges more fresh water into the ocean than the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. The plume of fresh water it releases extends more than 100 miles into the Atlantic, diluting the salt water of the open ocean across an area so vast it can be detected from space. Its origins trace back millions of years to a time when the river actually flowed westward toward the Pacific. When the Andes began rising, pushed upward by the collision of tectonic plates, that ancient drainage network had nowhere to go. It reversed direction entirely, redirecting billions of gallons of water eastward across the continent and carving out a basin that now stretches nearly 4,000 miles from the mountains to the sea. The river that resulted is not a stable, predictable channel. It splits, merges, shifts, and rebuilds itself constantly. As sandbars migrate, islands drift downstream over decades. Entire riverbanks collapse under seasonal pressure, taking trees, soil, and anything built too close to the edge with them. For the millions of people who live along its length, navigating this river means understanding its moods, reading subtle changes in current, color, and surface texture that signal depth, submerged debris, or the presence of hidden channels cutting through what looks like open water. And beyond navigation, the river functions as the primary highway of the entire interior. Boats carry fuel, food, medicine, building materials, and people across distances that no road network could realistically serve. It is the circulatory system of a civilization built around water. Chão. The Amazon rainforest is routinely described as a single ecosystem, but that description barely scratches the surface of what it actually contains. Within less than half a square mile, you can find more tree species than exist in some entire nations. And yet, this extraordinary diversity grows on soil that is, by most agricultural standards, remarkably poor. Nearly all of the forest's nutrients exist above ground, locked inside living wood, leaves, and root networks, cycling so rapidly through decomposition and regrowth that very little ever reaches the mineral soil beneath. A leaf that falls from a canopy tree can be fully decomposed and reabsorbed within weeks. This tight, as almost closed loop is what allows the forest to maintain its impossible richness on ground that would support very little else. And it allows the forest to bounce back with surprising speed, even after the most intense seasonal flooding strips and redistributes the surface layer. The vertical dimension of the forest adds another layer of complexity that most visitors never fully appreciate. The canopy stretches nearly 200 feet overhead, and up there, far above the forest floor, in a world of strong sunlight and drying wind, entirely different communities of species have built their lives without ever needing to descend. Frogs breed in pools of water, trapped inside bromeliads. Snakes hunt along branches that sway 150 feet above the ground. Entire food webs exist in the upper canopy that have no connection whatsoever to the dim or humid world below. Light levels, humidity, and temperature shift so dramatically between ground level and the treetops that the two environments might as well be different biomes sitting on top of each other. Researchers regularly discover species new to science simply by climbing into the upper canopy and looking carefully at what lives there. Alter do Chão looks like it was transplanted from a Caribbean postcard and dropped into the middle of the Amazon. And during the dry season, that comparison isn't entirely unfair. As the Tapajós River drops by up to 10 feet, it exposes wide, a curving white sand beaches surrounding water of a clarity that feels completely out of place in one of the world's most turbid river systems. The color of the water shifts from pale blue near the shore to deeper turquoise further out, and the beaches themselves are broad enough that you can walk for considerable distances without leaving the sand. It is, by almost any measure, one of the most visually improbable landscapes in the entire Amazon basin. The explanation lies in the river's geology. The Tapajós flows over stable, sandy terrain that generates very little suspended sediment, leaving the water unusually clear and allowing sunlight to penetrate deep below the surface, producing the vivid tones that photographers travel thousands of miles to capture. But this landscape is fundamentally seasonal, and the transition between its two states is abrupt. When the rains return and water levels rise, those beaches disappear entirely beneath the surface. Within weeks, open sand becomes river bottom. The forest floods. Fish move into the submerged groves to feed on fruits, all directly into the water. The entire shoreline becomes an aquatic habitat, and communities that fished from sandy banks just months earlier are now navigating by boat through what was recently open ground. That rhythm between exposed and submerged, between beach and forest floor, between one world and its replacement, defines everything here, from the local economy to the timing of festivals. Iquitos holds a distinction that few cities anywhere in the world can claim. It is one of the largest urban centers on Earth, with no road connection to the outside world. No highway reaches it, no bridge crosses to it, no overland route of any kind connects it to the broader road networks of Peru or its neighbors. The only ways in are by river or by air, and that isolation, which might seem like a disadvantage, has in many ways become the defining feature of the city's identity. Its rise came quickly, fueled by the same rubber boom that transformed Manaus. Fortunes materialized almost overnight, and wealthy merchants began importing European furniture, decorative tiles, and architectural details, assembling a city of surprising elegance in the middle of the Peruvian Amazon. The most striking example is a building whose iron facade was supposedly designed by Gustave Eiffel, though historians debate the attribution, that still stands today as evidence of the extraordinary ambitions of that brief era. When the rubber industry collapsed and those fortunes evaporated, Iquitos had to find a different reason to exist. And it did, slowly rebuilding itself around the rivers that had always been its true lifeline. Today, those rivers still govern daily life in ways that are immediately visible to any visitor. Seasonal floods raise water levels by nearly 10 feet each year, forcing entire neighborhoods to adapt, raising structures on stilts, repositioning markets to higher ground, reconfiguring the routes that boats travel through the floating districts that extend over the water's surface. Boats function as taxis, delivery vehicles, and the closest thing to public transit the city has. The forest pushes against the city limits on every side, and its presence is everywhere, in the medicinal plants sold openly in the markets, in the fishing traditions practiced along the riverbanks, in the knowledge that passes between generations without ever being written down. Pacaya-Samiria earns its nickname, the mirrored forest, most completely during the wet season, when floodwaters rise until stretches of trees stand submerged to their lower branches, and the still surface of the water becomes a near-perfect reflection of the canopy floating above it. The sky, the trees, and the water become almost indistinguishable from each other. At certain moments, in certain light, it becomes genuinely difficult to determine which direction is up. A disorientation that feels less like a visual trick and more like the landscape itself has quietly doubled. What makes this reserve scientifically exceptional is the degree to which its wildlife has adapted not merely to flooding, but to extreme, prolonged flooding as the central organizing principle of life. The entire ecological calendar here is built around water. Fish abandon their river channels and move into the flooded forest to feed on fallen fruit. Species that have evolved digestive systems specifically designed to process the seeds and pulp of particular tree species. Pink river dolphins follow new corridors that open only when water levels are high enough, hunting in spaces that will be dry land again in a matter of months. Oh, even the trees themselves have evolved physiological strategies for surviving months of submersion without losing root function or bark integrity. The reserve covers more than 7,700 square miles, making it one of the largest protected areas in Peru. But its significance isn't about size. It functions as a biodiversity reservoir, sheltering species that exist nowhere else and providing researchers with one of the most valuable benchmarks available for understanding how flooded tropical ecosystems respond to long-term climate change. Human communities within the reserve navigate all of this using inherited knowledge, routes, and landmarks that exist only during the dry season, replaced by an entirely different mental map once the rains arrive and the forest becomes water. Tambopata is defined by concentration. Wildlife here doesn't just exist. It accumulates, drawn by a combination of habitat variety, reliable water access, and geological features that function as natural gathering points across the reserve. Rivers wind past oxbow lakes, former river channels abandoned when the main flow shifted course, now isolated as still, crescent-shaped bodies of water that develop their own distinct ecosystems over time. Along the riverbanks, exposed clay deposits draw large mammals and birds in numbers rarely seen elsewhere in the Amazon. Those clay deposits play a specific and well-documented biological role. Many species, from tapirs to large macaws, consume the mineral-rich material to neutralize toxins absorbed from their diet. They return to the same sites with such regularity that researchers can plan observation schedules around their arrivals, knowing which species will appear, at roughly what time, and in approximately what numbers on any given morning of the dry season. The habitat diversity across Tambopata is equally remarkable. Elevation, soil type, and forest age shift across relatively short distances, meaning a single day of hiking can carry you through ecosystems with almost nothing in common. From dense, old-growth forest with canopy closing 150 feet overhead to open riverside habitats where light reaches the ground and entirely different plant communities have taken hold. Some surveys of small areas, just a couple of square miles, have recorded more tree species than exist across entire temperate regions of the Northern Hemisphere. Seasonal rains reshape the landscape further still, cutting new river channels, flooding low ground, and redirecting the movement of animals across the reserve. And at the center of all this biological intensity lies one of the Amazon's most visually spectacular recurring events, something that combines color, sound, and precise animal behavior. Clay licks, known locally as colpas, are among the most dramatic wildlife gatherings anywhere in the Amazon, and among the most reliably spectacular natural events anywhere on Earth. At first light, sometimes before the sun has fully cleared the tree line, dozens of macaws begin arriving at exposed riverbank walls to feed on mineral-rich clay. They come in waves, first landing in nearby trees and scanning for predators, then descending in groups to press themselves against the pale, clay face. On peak mornings, the numbers can reach into the hundreds, a shifting, screaming mass of scarlet, blue and green, that fills the air with a noise carrying for considerable distances through the surrounding forest. The colors alone are arresting, but the behavior behind them is what makes kolpas genuinely fascinating. The biological logic is straightforward, but remarkable. Macaws consume seeds and fruits that contain chemical compounds, tannins, alkaloids, and other secondary metabolites that plants produce specifically to discourage consumption. In small quantities, these compounds are tolerable. In the quantities that macaws ingest as part of their normal diet, they can become harmful. The clay minerals appear to bind to those compounds in the gut, neutralizing them before they can cause damage, and allowing the birds to safely exploit food sources that would otherwise require careful rationing. The consistency of this behavior, the same sites visited at the same seasons, with timing closely linked to shifts in the local fruiting cycle, has made kolpas the focus of long-term research programs tracking feeding patterns, flock social structures, and the vocal communication that seems to coordinate group decisions about when to descend and when to retreat. Not every stretch of riverbank qualifies. Gocta Waterfall plunges an estimated 2,500 feet in 2 separate drops, a combined height that places it among the tallest cascades in South America, and possibly among the tallest on Earth. What makes that fact even more striking is that the outside world had essentially no knowledge of its full dimensions until 2005, when a formal measurement was finally conducted and the numbers were published in scientific literature. At a waterfall of this scale, hidden in plain sight until the 21st century. The reason for that obscurity becomes apparent the moment you approach. Gocta sits inside a steep cloud forest canyon where dense vegetation, persistent mist, and genuinely difficult terrain combine to make access both challenging and disorienting. The surrounding slopes receive extraordinary amounts of rainfall, which feeds the constant flow over the cliff edge, but also maintains the thick forest cover that keeps the waterfall hidden from any distant vantage point. Even with established trails passing through local villages and forested corridors, reaching the base of the falls requires several hours of hiking through humid, rugged terrain. At the waterfall's height creates its own localized climate. Mist rises far above the canyon floor. Leticia occupies one of the most geopolitically unusual positions of any city in South America, sitting precisely at the point where Colombia, Brazil, and Peru share a common border along the Amazon River. 3 countries, 3 legal systems, 3 currencies, and 3 distinct cultural traditions all converge within walking distance of each other. Cross a street, and you're in a different nation. The city functions simultaneously as a Colombian port, a gateway to the Brazilian Amazon, and a departure point for river travel into Peru. And the resulting mix of influences gives it a character that feels unlike any other Amazonian city. Its markets reflect this layering directly and visibly. Colombian produce sits beside Peruvian textiles and Brazilian goods in stalls where the currency being used might change from one transaction to the next, and where the languages mixing in conversation might shift mid-sentence. As the river provides the transportation infrastructure that holds this together, with boats moving people and cargo across distances that would be completely impractical by land, connecting remote communities that have no road access to the commercial hub that Leticia represents. Step outside the city in almost any direction, and the forest closes in almost immediately. The canopy begins within minutes of leaving the urban edge, and the transition from city street to dense rainforest is abrupt enough to feel slightly surreal. Local communities draw on that proximity daily, gathering food and medicinal plants from the surrounding forest and applying ecological knowledge that has accumulated across generations of careful observation. The Cuyabeno Wildlife Reserve in Ecuador offers something that many parts of the Amazon can't easily provide: consistently observable wildlife in a setting that remains genuinely wild. Its network of blackwater lakes and seasonally flooded forests creates conditions where animals concentrate in predictable locations, making sustained observation far more reliable than in the dense, uniform jungle surrounding it. For researchers and travelers alike, that predictability is rare and valuable in an ecosystem where many species can go unseen for days at a time, despite being present in large numbers. The blackwater chemistry is central to why Cuyabeno works the way it does. The high acidity and low turbidity of the water suppress certain organisms, particular bacteria, algae, and invertebrates that thrive in nutrient-rich whitewater, while actively supporting others, producing species communities that differ meaningfully from those found in the sediment-rich systems nearby. Around the lakes, that difference becomes directly visible. Monkeys work through the canopy overhead, searching for fruit. River dolphins patrol the edges of submerged vegetation with unhurried efficiency. And birds arrive and depart in patterns tightly linked to water levels and time of day. During certain morning hours, at certain water levels, the concentration of wildlife around the largest lakes approaches something genuinely extraordinary. And indigenous communities within the reserve don't just inhabit this landscape. They manage it, applying detailed knowledge of plant properties, animal behavior, and seasonal navigation to both conservation decisions and sustainable tourism practices that have been refined over generations. As water levels drop toward the dry season, and forest paths re-emerge from beneath the receding water, the terrain begins its gradual transition toward higher ground and toward a river that, when conditions align with rare precision, produces one of the most visually extraordinary natural phenomena anywhere on the continent. Caño Cristales is commonly called the River of Five Colors, but that name, vivid as it is, significantly understates the precision of what actually produces the display. The reds, yellows, pinks, greens, and blues covering the riverbed all originate from a single aquatic plant, Macarinia clavigera, which blooms only when a very specific and narrow set of conditions are simultaneously satisfied. The water must be shallow and exceptionally clear. The sunlight must be direct and sustained throughout the day, and the current must move at exactly the right speed, fast enough to prevent sediment from settling on the plant's surface and blocking the light it needs, but slow enough that the plant isn't torn from the rock by the force of the flow. If any one of those variables falls outside the acceptable range, the colors either fail to develop or disappear entirely within days. That precision explains why Caño Cristales looks breathtaking in some months and almost ordinary in others, and why this phenomenon appears on this specific river. Canaima National Park covers more than 11,500 square miles of terrain in southern Venezuela, and its defining feature is something most people don't associate with the Amazon at all. Massive, flat-topped sandstone mountains called tepuis that rise abruptly from the surrounding lowland forest, like platforms lifted by some ancient geological force, their vertical walls dropping hundreds of feet to the trees below. On their summits, isolated by cliffs and altitude, separate worlds have been developing in biological silence for millions of years. These formations are ancient beyond easy comprehension. The rock making up the tepuis dates back nearly 2 billion years, placing it among the oldest exposed geology on Earth. When life on the planet consisted of little more than single-celled organisms in shallow seas, this rock was already old. Scientists describe the tepuis as islands in time, platforms lifted so far above the surrounding landscape and so completely cut off by sheer cliff faces that the plants and animals living on their summits have been following independent evolutionary paths for an almost incomprehensible span of time. Many species found on the tepuis exist nowhere else on the planet, not in nearby forests, not on neighboring summits, not anywhere else in the world. They are evolutionary experiments conducted in isolation, with no outside input and no possibility of escape. Canaima is also the location of Angel Falls, the tallest uninterrupted waterfall in the world, dropping nearly 3,200 feet from the summit plateau of Aoyan Tepui, and the water falls so far that much of it disperses into mist before it reaches the ground, turning the lower section of the falls into a drifting column of vapor rather than a solid stream of water. During the rainy season, the volume increases dramatically, and the spray generated at the base rises hundreds of feet back up the cliff face, creating clouds that form and dissolve against the dark rock in a continuous cycle. Approaching by boat through the surrounding lagoon, with the cliff rising above you and the mist drifting across the water's surface, is one of those experiences that refuses to be adequately prepared for. But Canaima is larger than any single landmark. Its rivers run through pink sand beaches, the color produced by minerals leaching from the ancient sandstone, and cut into narrow canyon passages where the walls rise close enough on both sides to block out the sky. Wide valleys open between the tepui where the light shifts color across the rock faces throughout the day, moving from deep orange at dawn through pale gold at midday to rich red as the sun descends. The indigenous Piman people have lived within this landscape for generations, developing detailed knowledge of its geology, its notoriously unpredictable weather patterns, and the traditional routes that cross its most remote and least visited terrain. Knowledge that has no written equivalent and exists only because it has been passed carefully from one generation to the next.